Good evening. It's Brian Crombie on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My pleasure tonight to introduce you to Brian Lewis, who is the president of Medtech Canada. I wanted to reach out to Brian to find out what's happening in the medical technologies business in Canada. During COVID-19, it's probably even more important than people would think it has been in the past, and how people are responding. And undoubtedly, we'll talk about supply chains. We'll talk about government regulation. We'll talk about companies that are contributing to the COVID-19 pandemic issues, and we'll probably talk about some other companies that are harmed by the close down. So, Brian Lewis of Medtech Canada, how are you today, sir?
I am fine. Thank you very much, Brian, for allowing me to come onto your show. I very much appreciate it.
Our pleasure. So first of all, who is and what is Medtech Canada?
Okay, so Medtech Canada is the National Association for the Medical Technology Industry. We have members that are Canadian-based organizations and multinational organizations. What they all have in common is they either manufacture or supply medical devices that either improve or save lives, such as implantable medical devices, pacemakers, and hips and knees, medical imaging, X-rays and MRIs, and then blood tests. And with the coming of the COVID crisis, this industry has even become more important. More important in terms of providing of PPE, personal protective equipment, making sure that there are diagnostic tests so that people with COVID can be identified and treated or isolated, both.
Yep.
And then the treatment of people that are very, very sick with the COVID disease.
So do most of your members' products need Health Canada approvals, or are most of them products that don't need Health Canada approvals?
So 90% of our medical device products need Health Canada approval. Of the other 10% of the products, they're like the N95 masks or respirators that you hear about that are in such demand out there. What's required there is what's called a medical device establishment license. And what they look at with our members for those particular types of products is that they have the proper testing procedures to be able to test to make sure that the quality of those particular products are there.
Right. Okay. And so generally, how has the medtech business fared during COVID-19?
Most of the if you look at COVID-19, most of the medtech business has been like other businesses. 75% of our members have faced a profound decline in demand for product because of the deferral of surgeries and other procedures that are ongoing. In COVID, the hospital is just about shut down. And that has caused that those particular organizations weren't selling product. And even more importantly, those patients weren't getting the treatment that they needed to have. There was a bit of a delay that's put them off for a number of months. And will take a long time for us to be able to catch up.
What do you think is going to happen there? You know, it's interesting because I've heard some people say that, it's good because a whole bunch of people that were just cramming our emergency departments aren't going there anymore and are dealing with whatever their problems are. But then I've heard other people say, people with critical problems aren't getting treatment and maybe dying or having problems. And then other people say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to get this big bolus of demand come the fall as soon as COVID-19 calms down. So what's actually going to happen?
So that's a very good question that you're asking is what's going to happen. So first of all, you mentioned those individuals that are in serious shape and needed to get a treatment, a surgery or a procedure. They were delayed and they have been delayed for a period of time. What that's going to result in as we go forward in the fall is to look at it there's two elements to it. One, there is now a bigger backlog. Canada's always had backlog for surgeries. Now there's even a bigger backlog that's there than before. And because of COVID and the infection control procedures, let's say a given operating room was able to do a dozen procedures prior to COVID. Now it's only going to be able to do 8 or 7 because they have to follow infection control procedures. So what that's going to do is it's going to actually increase that wait time as we go forward. And it's going to take time for this to right itself for when we have a vaccine or a vaccine program that works to really diminish the disease.
Well, it's a fascinating industry that you're working in, and clearly beset with a bunch of opportunities that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, as well as some issues. Anyway, we're chatting with Brian Lewis, the president of Medical Device Canada. We're just going to be back in a minute after these messages. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Brian Lewis, who is the president of Medtech Canada, the industry association in Canada that medical device, medical technology companies are part of. Brian, I interviewed the CEO of Spartan Bioscience, and they had a portable DNA testing unit that was testing blood and DNA for a whole bunch of different things that they were reasonably quickly able to convert to being able to test on COVID-19. They got Health Canada approval. They launched, and then very quickly thereafter, I guess Health Canada said they weren't necessarily working and demanded they stop. And now they're hopeful to relaunch. What's happened with Health Canada and regulatory approvals? Have they quickened up? Maybe too quick? What's your sense of what the regulatory approval process has been during COVID-19?
Yeah, so during COVID-19, the regulatory approval process needed to evolve. And there's a couple of things. So the regular process is a rather extensive review that goes on for a medical device establishment license, and then in order to make sure you have the proper facility to manufacture, package, and distribute the product, and also for product approval. With the coming of the COVID crisis and the concern that there wasn't enough product out there, demand far was stripping the ability to supply the product. And so Health Canada went and put something in place called an interim order. And what that interim order is, specifically dealing with COVID critical products, it was a quicker way to get your product reviewed and tested. And some of those particular products, there were interim approvals that looked they were moving in a positive direction, but as time went on, these products didn't get approved. To give you an example, there were a number of N95 masks. So you know the respirators that they call the masks, the tight-fitting masks that are put on in surgery that literally filter out 95% of the particles that are in the air, which is a real concern with COVID during surgery. Those particular types of approvals for that particular product, the interim order dictates that you must have testing done in terms of certification of the product. And many of the products that were coming in with this vast demand, like Canada actually had about 6,000 different organizations respond to be able to provide product. When the testing was done on some of these products, it was either found to be substandard and it couldn't be used in the most critical setting or not used at all. And so the interim order was put in place to make things go more efficiently to get the products to people that need them. That's why it was there. But it's not the same degree of rigor as the usual process.
And so I think most people would think that having a faster approval process because of the pandemic emergency made sense. But you're saying in the end, a lot of companies didn't actually pass those tests.
No, they the tests that came in, they put them through. So the process for the most part worked very well, because when they did the certification, the products weren't working and they weren't allowed to be treated. Canadian patients weren't allowed to be treated. So they've done quite a good job. We have weekly consultations with Health Canada. One of the things that we've done is on our website, we have a site for what's called greenfield manufacturers, those people that have never made a medical device before, in terms of what they need to do to get on the Canadian market and what they need to look at for approval. Because when this first started, we were getting tens of calls, and so was Health Canada. And this website really helped focus them into that process.
Figure out what to do. Now, I interviewed George Irwin of Irwin Toys, and he started importing masks from China. If it's just a simple mask, that doesn't need Health Canada approval. Is that correct?
It depends on what the mask is. So those particular masks that are used in the hospital setting and healthcare, it depends on the mask. And it's not Health Canada approval, it's the manufacturing facility. And if they don't have that medical device establishment license, then you have to put it through that interim order, which, I don't know if you recall, there was something called N95 masks that came in from China. They looked as if when they first arrived on the scene, they were going to do the trick. And when they were tested, they were below grade. You can now buy them in the pharmacy to use for yourself walking around, rather than because it doesn't meet the grade that's required for surgery.
I spoke to the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association. Right after COVID-19 hit, he got a whole bunch of people together within his organization. I think partially because they were suffering job losses potentially, but also very importantly because they really wanted to help meet the pandemic demands. And they got people to produce different PPE. They did shields, they did a whole bunch of other things. What happened in your industry group?
The same sort of thing. In our industry group, people got together and they worked. They changed up to 50% of our members that manufacture, changed their manufacturing practices to be able to manufacture products that were required. There was collaborations that went on between industries. So would you like me to give you an example of something that happened in terms of in vitro diagnostic testing, so blood tests for COVID? There's a company called Roche that makes a blood test kit. It's manufactured outside of Canada. It came into Canada, but there was an issue. There was still a concern there wasn't enough products. You could take that Roche kit and divide it into two to get twice the number of people. So a kit was made for one, you could do it for two. But what they needed to do was take it to somebody that could actually take it in a sterile environment, pull the kit apart, and put it back together again so it could actually deal with two people. And so what happened was there was a collaboration between Canadian Hospital Specialties, an Oakville-based firm, and Roche Diagnostics, and they actually are making it now so that that particular product can now test two people, not just one.
I didn't even realize there was a blood test. I thought you had to have the swab up.
Sorry, I'm saying blood test. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said blood test. It's a swab. It's a swab test. It's a fluid. It's a liquid test. It's not a blood test.
Because we had this Spartan Bioscience that was working on a DNA test that would come from a blood sample. And then I heard that someone else was working on a saliva test. But the only one that really seems to have been quite successful and accurate seems to be this swab test, which I don't know if you've taken it, but it's extremely uncomfortable.
No, I haven't. I really practice infection control incredibly well and don't feel the need. I haven't got myself into a situation when I'm exposed. If I was, I'd do it in a moment. The interesting thing here is that, you've got, and you're right, it's a swab that they're actually inserting into your nose getting the fluid in order to do the test. And this allowed the doubling of the test. But something else that I felt that the government did that it was incredibly helpful. So you've heard of the Public Health Agency of Canada. Part of them is the National Microbiology Lab that oversees labs across the country and have a relationship with all of the provincial microbiology labs. So these are the people that are controlling testing. This particular organization called all of the manufacturers of medical grade in vitro diagnostic tests for COVID. They've got them all together for weekly meetings. And what they're looking at is who's got what supply of product where, who's developing new products coming along, and what's the demand across the country. Because what they want to do is optimize the supply of that particular products to go out to people that need it, so nobody's hoarding it in one spot and it's needed in another. I found it's been a really, really effective program. It's gone on for about 2 months now.
And who's the key behind that? That's a federal agency, and all the provincial agencies have cooperated. Because when you compare what you've just described to the United States, where we've heard different governors and even mayors talking about how they're in competition with each other to get tests and PPE, it almost seems like it's a hoarder's market down there.
Oh, absolutely. They wanted to prevent that here. It was really a really smart way to consider optimum supply of product, because they're talking all the time. And if they need to deal with individual company and their supply, they will actually have a call with the individual company. So you've got literally 14, 15 individuals sitting in a room weekly with the National Microbiology Lab.
Well, that seems that it's worked extremely well in Canada, and I'm glad we've got that versus what we saw.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But what's going to be really important going forward for this too is that all of us, you were just talking about being tested. For Canadians and for your listeners, we have to make sure we continue to follow infection control the way we've been doing it, and possibly even better than we can, because Canada, it really is a model for the world in terms of what we've done. So there's some areas that are opening up in Ontario to the phase 3, but people need to keep following the infection control, because in that way we'll make sure we don't overburden the system.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah.
One of the big issues, particularly I think early on in this pandemic, has been supply chain, where
Yes.
President Donald Trump actually, I think at one point in time, stopped 3M from shipping masks across the border. And I've had a
Yes.
couple of people tell me that it's almost as if the era of globalization maybe hasn't stopped, but it hit a major roadblock. And a lot of companies are thinking about reshoring their production and are reticent to be reliant on demand supply from China, from the United States, from anywhere that might prohibit the export of their products for whatever nationalistic kind of reasons. What do you think is happening in the medical device business in regards to global outsourcing and global supply chains?
So what we're talking about, and what our members are talking about, we just to let you know, we have meetings with Public Service and Procurement Canada too, where they bring all the producers of PPE, ventilators, and in vitro diagnostics and vaccination products in a room together to talk about things. And one of the things that we put out there is that there's 3 things that we believe need to be done, and it's actually in alignment with what you're saying, Brian. It's diversity of supply chain. You can't just have one source. You have to be able to get multiple sources, whether it's the United States or China, but then an at-home capability as well that needs to exist so that we don't go through the same situation we did before. So that's the diversity of supply chain. The second thing is optimal inventory management. There was no supply. We tend to follow the auto industry's just in time. There's not warehouses the way there used to be, and there needs to be a supply of inventory that for certain products. We need to have it there, so there's a 60 to 90 day buffer, so that if we run into an issue like this again, people have time to actually scale up their production. Because there was no such thing, so we got caught flat-foot, for lack of a better reason. And if you do this inventory supply, it's not stockpiling alone, because you can have the federal government go and buy 12 million masks 6 months from now. And if it sits in a warehouse, they expire eventually. You have to follow that inventory management where the first product in is first out. You roll the product through and keep it fresh, and possibly do it at every procurement across the country. So determine what are those products that you need to do that with. So that's really important. The next thing that's important is the capability at home to manufacture those products, the capability to access raw materials or component parts. Understand that as we get into it and we actually move towards that diversity of supply chain. Are we able to access the component parts?
I heard from a union leader I interviewed that there was a judicial review after the SARS epidemic in 2003. And one of their major recommendations was exactly what you're talking about, inventory management and the rotation of that inventory. And he said it was as if we never read the report. And there were respirators or ventilators and masks that were just never checked on and never cleaned and never updated and never turned. And
it's the same story that I heard. Yeah, that's what happened. And the government is aware of this. One of the nice things that are going on is particularly Quebec and Ontario are going through a process that they call supply chain centralization. And our members and myself and others have been in conversation with Ontario and Quebec for 6, 7, 8 months prior to the COVID crisis. And they're moving in the right direction. We just have to make sure they continue to move in that direction, that they do all of these things. Because sometimes Canadian procurement is about how do you get the cheapest price up front, how do you hold it for the cheapest amount, how do you make that more efficient, versus looking at the outcomes.
Right.
So for certain products, we need to do things differently.
We're chatting tonight with Brian Lewis. He is the president of Medtech Canada. We're going to take a quick break and come back more on medical devices and medical technologies and how they can help us. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight about medical devices, and we're chatting with Brian Wilson. Brian Wilson?
Lewis.
Lewis. I knew it was wrong. I apologize. Brian Lewis,
okay.
president of Medtech Canada. Brian, a couple of questions. I have had a couple of issues and called the doctor and had everything done virtually. And you know what? It was amazing. It was far more efficient than before. I told him what my problem was. I took a picture. The guy and actually it was fascinating because it's a medical app that he sent me to that I've got to do all the communication called Medio. Have you ever heard about this app?
Heard of other ones, Babylon and others, but I haven't heard of that one. But there's a number of them out there.
So all of the communication is secure through this app, and he diagnosed me virtually and sent a prescription, and I went and picked it up. It was awesome. So what's happened with virtual care?
So it's really interesting what happened with virtual care. The government, in its wisdom in Ontario, looked at what was happening with COVID and the need to keep people isolated, but still people have health issues. They need to be treated. They need to be monitored. And what they went and did is that if you will, the move towards increased virtual care probably moved forward 5 years. They reduced some of the red tape barriers in terms of reimbursement to physicians and the system so that people could be paid for physicians and others could be paid for doing this work and making sure that people were connected in. So that's a huge change that allowed many people not to be exposed and to be treated in a safer environment. What we want is to make sure that those changes, which were interim changes, stay there for the longer term, because this is a real benefit to Canadians. You saw how efficient it was for yourself.
It was a lot more efficient. The alternative would have been I'd have to have spent an hour, 45 minutes sitting in some doctor's waiting room and then do the same process. And, lucky if and take half an hour to drive there. And, it was far more efficient. No question.
Yes, it absolutely is. So we really hope they do that. And as we continue in the COVID time period, it's critical. It's critical that people are able to be treated in that manner.
What about digital health? Do you think it's going to grow dramatically?
I actually believe that digital health will absolutely grow over time because it's the data, it's patient data and how people respond to their treatments. And if we're able to better understand how individuals and versus their profile respond to certain treatments or drugs, we can become a lot better at actually giving the right therapy, which if you give the right therapy, makes the system more efficient, the patient is more healthy, saves costs. There is an absolute desire for that to move forward. And I think you're going to see it happen, because of COVID. A lot of it is going to really leverage this going forward.
I was at a conference in the United States in January before COVID-19, and there were a couple of different companies that were presenting digital health solutions that were actually going through clinical trials to prove that they were efficacious and reduced either the time with a disease or the incidence of a disease, and they were actually being submitted to the FDA for approval and getting FDA designations for them. Does that happen here as well?
So when you take a look at those products and the clinical research being done on them, Health Canada, within what's called the Medical Device Directorate, they have one of the divisions is IT, data and digital health. So those particular products need to go through the same degree of approval that any other medical technology does. And that's a fairly new division, about 18 months to 2 years old. But we're doing that here as well because there is such an opportunity here. And if you take a look, Mississauga, where you're hosted from, it's the third largest medical technology hub in Canada. There's over 125 medical technology companies, and many of those deal with digital health and virtual care.
Right.
Right in your own backyard.
What's the financing situation for medical technology companies now? Are they able to go public? Are they able to raise money? Do they have to go public and move to the United States or the U.S. stock markets to grow? What's the situation right now?
Well, I think you've nailed it on the head, is that unfortunately for these companies to grow, there's better money from the U.S. in terms of investment in innovative companies. What we see happen is some companies stay here and actually get them, approach the United States investors and are able to stay here, but many of them move to the United States as well. So that hasn't changed appreciably in the last while. But with a stronger ecosystem here, the more companies that you've got working in digital health, like Canada is one of the leading countries in artificial intelligence in the world, and the more we build that ecosystem of support, then the degree of comfort the investors have. And I think we'll get more investment here in Canada.
What do you mean by an ecosystem of support? Do you suggest that these companies are working together and cooperating?
There's a cooperation. So what you want to have is the more you have a body of individuals that do research and development in this area. So AI is one of the artificial intelligence is one of those areas. In vitro diagnostics, we talked about the nasal swabs for COVID. That's another one. There are enough companies around that are doing it that there are the universities, research institutions are focused on it. There is a workforce to pull from and grow, and that's some of the things that are developing in those areas. I actually sit on an advisory council with the National Research Council of Canada, and they've indicated that as well too, is that the area of connected health technologies, in vitro diagnostics as well, are two really, really high growth areas.
Really? Fantastic.
Yeah.
I used to be in the pharmaceutical industry, and people would say, if you want to make sure that you get great executives, you've got to be in New Jersey, because you got to be in that ecosystem of people. Is that the case in medical devices? Is there a place in the world you've got to be, or can you locate yourself in the Greater Toronto area?
You can locate yourself. So the thing is, for medical technologies, you can locate yourself anywhere. You just have to have connections. And with our virtual world, where you and I, the way you're interviewing me right now virtually, the three large centers for AI is Edmonton, Montreal, and Toronto. And what happens is virtually those three centers connect and share what they're working on. So it's almost like it's one research center in some ways. And that's beginning to happen more and more.
What do you think the future is going to be of medical devices? Are we going to have a proliferation and continued growth of medical devices, and so that when you think about the healthcare dollar, increasing percentage is going to be spent on devices and AI and things like that?
I think what we're going to see as we go forward, and to give you an example, is we talked about Mississauga. Over the last 5 years, medical technology companies have grown by 70% in Mississauga. In terms of if you look in life sciences in Mississauga, there's 20,000 people that are employed in the life sciences. When you look at this particular industry, I think that one of the things that has to happen as we go forward is procurement. The supply chain needs to switch to something called total cost of care. Right now, we tend to look at the upfront purchase price rather than looking at the total cost of care. There are medical technologies that are out there that if you look at the upfront purchase price, it may be the same or greater than what you're paying with a previous generation of a product, but the downstream impact of that particular product is huge, that you save the system money. But one of the things is the system is set up in silos. The OR has a certain budget, and then the general practitioners pay out of a certain budget. And one of the things that supply chain centralization in Ontario is they're actually looking at the total cost of care. How do we find that we can actually do that? Because what you get out of it is better health outcomes, and you're most likely going to save money as well. Because if you have better health outcomes, it's not that chronic patient coming back all the time. I was told of a virtual product in the United States that's not in Canada yet. It's a product, for kids that have asthma, the inhalers, the puffers,
yeah.
Right? The puffers, there's a device that you can hook up to it that actually shows how often a person is using that inhaler, how well they're actually getting the medicine, and they can predict if somebody's going into an acute asthmatic attack. What that means is they can get to that patient sooner before they go into that acute attack and get them treated. So it saves, it's more efficient for the system, better for the patient.
Well, I had this one presentation, which sounds absurd, but they were telling me about how many patients ended up having real problems because of getting out of beds or falling out of beds. and they had a little pressure, something or other, put underneath hospital beds to alert nurses when patients started moving, such they were going to be trying to get out of the bed or actually getting out of the bed. And just stopping patients from getting out of the bed on an uncontrolled manner and trying to get to the washroom or doing whatever they were going to do saved lives.
Isn't that so simple, though? That's not complex. That's simple, right? But it means so much. It's about value to that patient, right?
Shocking.
Yeah, it is.
We're chatting with Brian Lewis, the president of the medical technology business in Canada, the industry association that deals with that. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to our show tonight, Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting with Brian Lewis, who is the president of Medtech Canada, and we've been talking about the medical technology business. There's this fantastic book that I don't know whether you've read, Brian, or not. It's called Homo Deus. It's written by a guy by the name of Yuval Noah Harari. He actually wrote several different bestsellers. Homo Sapiens was one of those books that was about the evolution of humanity over time, that President Obama claimed at one point in time was the best book he ever read. But then Homo Deus was interesting because what it did is it suggested that in the future, medical devices, medical technology, genetic testing, etc., are going to be available, but they're going to be available only to the rich, and that what they risk doing is creating a part of humanity that are sort of almost half machine and part human, that are going to be superior to everyone else, and it's going to be almost like a godlike or almost godlike part of the human race. And he talks about bionic ears, he talks about bionic hearing, he talks about artificial limbs, he talks about artificial intelligence, genetic testing, that you can stream out a whole bunch of other things. And he refers back to his book Homo Sapiens and says that one of the biggest travesty in history was that Homo sapiens treated Neanderthals like they were dogs, even though they were effectively our cousins. And he says the risk here is that if we don't control the use of medical devices and medical technology and digital technology and genetic testing, we risk doing the same thing. What do you think? Anything in there?
Well, that's really interesting, that that particular perspective. And it's like saying that there's people that'll be able to afford the most expensive developments that are out there. What I tend to think is that medical technologies, connected health technologies, data and digital health, all moving in a really positive direction. The research and development that's happening is absolutely amazing that's going on out there. But I think about it from the respect of a rising tide raises all boats. Because what I'm seeing is that there's products that are being developed that are able to treat out in remote areas. A lot of medical technology companies looked at the areas of India, the Middle East, and now Africa, and looking at very unique products that are more simplistic, but can actually help to treat those that don't have a lot of money. An example of really strong research that's going on in Canada and in vitro diagnostics and other areas is called microfluidics. Lab on a chip. Microfluidics. And what it is, you're aware of a transistor chip.
Yep.
This is a chip that actually has fluids in it. And you're able to test fluid samples from an individual in this particular small chip with a small amount of fluid. You're able to do it anywhere in the world, and it's a technology where Canada excels beyond belief. So when I look at those sorts of things, handheld ultrasounds that are used in Africa and other countries, I think we're going to see that there's going to be a broad development of products over time, and that the rising tide will lift all boats and healthcare and make it better.
Well, I grew up a geek watching Star Trek, and Dr. McCoy had that, what was it called? The tricorder.
Tricorder.
And be able to tell you everything was wrong, what bone was broken, whatever. And I'm waiting for the tricorder.
Yeah, I am as well too. And I don't think it's too far in the future.
Brian Lewis, if you had a message for Canadians about the medical device business and medtech business and what it's contributing to the COVID-19 effort, what would it be?
It's that the industry is behind producing as much as they possibly can and collaborating with other companies and solution providers to maximize the supply of product that's required for protection and treatment for COVID. They've really worked quite tirelessly and are really focused on getting those products to people that need them.
Well, and we appreciate all you and your industry's efforts in that regard. That said, I still think that just simple washing of your hands, covering your mouth when you sneeze or cough, wearing a mask, social distancing, actually not social distancing, physical distancing.
Yes.
6 feet, 2 meters is some pretty rudimentary things that we can
Absolutely, and it's the best thing to do. It honestly is. Agree
Excellent.
with you fully.
Brian Lewis, President of Medtech Canada, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really pleasure chatting with you. And if you ever want to come back and talk about some exciting medical devices or financings or whatnot, please feel free to join us.
I'd appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.